I'd like to welcome up on stage our next session on digital fragmentation from a user perspective. This session on digital fragmentation looks at it as a process which is driven by a variety of political, economic, and technical policy decisions. This interactive session will explore digital fragmentation from a user perspective, including how users may be experiencing it in the UK and beyond, and how we can prevent further fragmentation in the future. Our chair is going to be Izaan from the Internet Society Youth Standing Group, who's going to be joining us. Sheetal Kumar, a digital rights advocacy expert. Rachel Coldicutt, founder and executive director from Careful Industries. And Alice Taylor, research manager from Oxford Information Labs. Thank you, and I'll pass you over to Izaan.
Good morning, everyone here, and good afternoon and good evening to those joining us online, wherever you may be from. My name is Izaan Khan. I am a member of the Internet Society's Youth Standing Group, and I'm joined today by an excellent panel. We've had tons of really great discussions in the green room as well as over the course of the week about this exact topic, which is about you, all of you. And so I believe this is meant to be an interactive session, although I don't really know where my clicker is, so I would need to show the slide of questions, but hopefully that will be sorted out eventually. But it depends a lot on your engagement as much as it is ours. And I thought it would be helpful to start off with the definition of internet fragmentation itself, primarily because that's where most of the conversations are had without moving any further. And so in the interest of not engaging in terminological debates and discussions, we've focused on the user experience, because we believe that is the area and the perspective that matters the most. The first controversial statement of the day. Fragmentation of the user experience is the phenomenon where different end users of the internet, when trying to perform similar actions online, are presented with different content, different options, different interfaces that can happen either because of their own choice or because of choices that were imposed on them by governments, platforms, etc. And so what I'd like to start off with, and perhaps Sheetal, we can start off with you first and then move to the rest, is to give our audience, an understanding of how user experience fragmentation really manifests itself, what you may have seen throughout the course of your work, what you may have personally experienced in this space. And we want to think about it in a very intersectional way, looking at things like age. How would a 16-year-old experience the internet differently to a pensioner? We want to look at things like gender. We want to look at things like economic status and accessibility to the internet. Give us an idea of how exactly user experience fragmentation would manifest itself.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and see some familiar faces, and welcome to those who haven't been to an IGF before. I've been to many, and it's a very important space to have these discussions about the evolving internet. So one of the reasons I think I was asked to be here is that I have been co-facilitating the policy network on internet fragmentation, which is an intersessional work stream of the global IGF. And there, as you said, is we were grappling with in the first year of the policy network, what even is internet fragmentation? And I'm glad we're focusing in on the user experience here, because if you just take it more broadly, you can end up discussing issues that then can make people feel like they don't have a good grasp on the topic. And we need, I think, a good grasp and a collective understanding of the problems we face so that we can come up with solutions. And I think the user perspective is so important, because ultimately we care about the internet and we are here because it's about people. We don't have the internet for the sake of having the internet. What I would say about what we need to think about when it comes to user experience is really whether or not users have agency and control and their rights respected on the internet. And that is really what is essential when we're thinking about internet fragmentation, because plurality and diversity of experience and a decentralized internet and having options is not a bad thing. We want that. Those are the values that we need to preserve. So when you ask, do people have different experiences on the internet? Absolutely. And I think that's a good thing. When, for example, women and girls have a different experience on the internet because they're facing online violence that removes their ability to participate safely, or actually means that they don't feel safe in the world more generally, then that is a type of fragmentation which results in a lot of user control and agency and undermines rights. And that's not what we want to see. You asked about personal experience. So I know we have lots to get through. So I didn't realize that we were talking about personal experience. So I was thinking about an experience I had with my provider about a year ago. I was working on the topic of the responsible state behavior framework on ICTs, which has been developed by the UN to govern how states engage with each other online. And it's a first committee process. It fits within the discussions on peace, security, and conflict. And I was trying to access the website, the UN website, and it was blocked by my provider. And I kept coming across an explanation that it was a topic, an issue, or there was something content there that was apparently illegal, and it was just about conflict, peace, and security. And I can tell you, I could not access a person. I kept coming across a box, and I could not get my access back on my network at home to this website. It was so infuriating. So that's one aspect. When I knew that what I needed to access was legal and I needed to access it, but there was something in the way that meant that my ability, my agency was affected, and I couldn't actually remedy it. So that's a crucial issue I think we need to think about as well.
Thanks, Sheetal. Rachel, let's move on to you next. What about you? What are your thoughts on the experience of the internet? How can it be different across different demographics? And if you have any personal stories to share, we'd be interested to hear as well.
Hi, everyone. So I suppose maybe I'll begin with a slightly different personal goal, which is I've been knocking around on the internet for a long time. So I started working on the internet in 1995. And I think there were a lot of things we thought were achievable and desirable then that we've since realized are maybe not really practical. And I think, although it is very important on the one hand to talk about user experience, I think we can't talk about the idea of fragmentation without recognizing that the infrastructure of the internet is now fundamentally monopolistic, and that we are reliant on a tiny number of companies to keep everything moving. If there are two things that I think I've seen again in 2025, it's that nobody knows what is real anymore. And the other is, you better hope that AWS doesn't go down, right? And so if we're looking at fragmentation from the perspective of fundamentally inequitable, monopolistic infrastructure, I think we need to actually turn it over and think about what pluralism means. Because the more we're trying to hold one experience for everyone and everything, the more that gives power to a tiny number of companies. And I think as well, one of the things we often begin with is trying to save people after a bad thing has happened, and that actually the internet is old enough now. We've been doing this for long enough to know that there are anticipatory measures, that there is resilience that we need to think about. And so I suppose I would almost turn it around. And for me, how can we have pluralistic, resilient, equitable infrastructure that allows everyone to have the experience they want and need? And I suppose I'll end by talking a little bit about digital inclusion. So I've worked in digital inclusion for ages now, right? And there's this interesting idea that everybody needs to be included into a minimum. And I think that's a really inequitable approach, because what we really want is for everyone to be included in the way that works for them. And you particularly see in the UK, we have a lot of fragmentation because of economic poverty, right? We call it kinds of things. We call it digital poverty. But digital poverty is poverty. If you cannot connectivity a device, you're left out. And I think particularly it's really important to think about what fragmentation means when, for instance, government is relying on potentially very modern technologies. So thinking about digital identity, which I know will be talked about later today, how can everybody in the country have access to secure encrypted technology if not everybody has an up-to-date device? And so I think it's important to think fragmentation is not just something that happens to you in the moment as a user. It's something that begins way down in the infrastructure chain. And I think that's what we have an opportunity to continue working on to improve.
Thank you, Rachel. And lastly, we have Alice. Yes, what are your thoughts on user experience fragmentation? And we'd appreciate it if you could also bring it in the context of the youth perspective.
Yes, I've been told I'm bringing the youth. Very flattering. So yeah, I've got the sort of the youth perspective, but I've also got my background was as a speech and language therapist. And I work with children, but I also work with adults with learning disabilities. And I think working with adults with learning disabilities, they're a very protected group because they're very discriminated against. And I remember reading about and that hearing about some cases where people would try and restrict an adult with a learning disability's access to social media. And in many cases, this was deemed to be a deprivation of their liberty. And so you'd have to put in place a deprivation of liberty safeguards because it's deemed now basically a fundamental human right to have access to the internet and social media. And so then looking at like children and how children are treated, and particularly I think what's happening in Australia at the moment is a really interesting case study in just going, all children shouldn't have access to social media anymore. And that seems like such a radical move because me as an adult, if someone said to me, you're no longer allowed to go on this, like this, and I'd be like, whoa, hold on. And for an adult, that would be deemed a kind of like human rights violation almost. And I think it's really interesting. I'm thinking about fragmentation from an age point of view, that we seem to just see children and young people as this kind of like block that can have things done to them. And we don't think about their rights as people. And in many ways with Australia, I look at the list of like platforms that they banned. And in some ways, this is like a sort of 50-year-old's idea of the apps that young people use, like Facebook, Instagram, Threads. But then there are other apps that I'm really surprised to see on the list, like YouTube. And it's like, this is deemed a social media platform, but it's also like a content creation platform. And there are lots of like people under the age of 16 who are content creators, and they've used their YouTube account to make stuff and to share it with the world and also potentially monetize some of their videos. And if you're in Australia and you're a 16-year-old with your YouTube channel, that is now deleted. It's like all your videos are gone. Your account has been deleted. And what I think is also really interesting is some of the platforms and applications that have not been banned, like Roblox and Steam.
Yeah.
Steam is a place, and like a lot of gaming chat platforms are places where for a lot of young people, and particularly women, and particularly like racial minorities, there is just absolute chaos. There is horrible stuff going on in a way that it just feels like, I think if you're a young person and you're in Australia or in the UK, I would feel very like the people in this room where 34 is still considered the youth. I would feel very disconnected from the people who are making decisions about my access to the internet.
Thank you so much, Alice. I think at this point, what I'd like to do is encourage everyone to go to Slido. You can join using that number or a scan with your QR code as well, and answer the question, do you think your online experience resembles most other people's? Yes, no, maybe. And we give you an opportunity as well to provide explanations if you would like. We will be displaying that as well. And if we find that there's some interesting threads in there, we may also pick up from that and continue on that thread. But I'd like to, in the meantime, go back to the discussion on how user experience fragmentation manifests itself and really dig down into the major sources and causes of fragmentation. Rachel, you had mentioned, for example, this begins all the way down at the infrastructural level, and we have an issue of monopolistic control of platforms and infrastructure by big tech corporations based in Silicon Valley. On the other hand, we had you, Alice, talk to us about how this can sometimes be governmentally imposed at the top level. Regulators who don't necessarily understand the user experience aspect, essentially imposing conditions on what can be accessed by different demographics. So I'd really like to nail in there and try to figure out what you think, in your opinion, and we'll move across the panel for this question. What are the sources that we should be paying attention to that you see increasing fragmentation these days? And what are the consequences of that type of user experience fragmentation that is being driven by those particular types of sources? If there's a governmental regulation, what's the consequence of increased governmental regulation? If there is this increasing control towards monopoly, increasing tendency towards monopoly, what is the consequence of that for the user experience of the internet? So I guess for this question, we can go backwards if that's fine. So we'll start with you, Alex.
Yeah, I guess to me, thinking about differences in age, I think, and there's also this difference between the digital native and the person who has like adopted technology in the online world later in life, and what it's like for young people growing up, just born with access to the internet, born with access to social media, literally from like day one. And, you know, how different that is. And also, I think you were talking about like factors that fuel this fragmentation. Obviously, there's the technical, but there's also the societal. And, you know, what I've really observed in young people is that it seems to be a massive social movement with the whole like manosphere and the incel world. That is such a big force of division I see, which is very social and not about the technical, which is definitely dividing a lot of young people online and also older people. But then, yeah, with the technical side, I was talking about like the Australia social media ban, or there was also the America trying to ban TikTok, which I thought was very interesting because you deem it a national security threat, you ban TikTok, and then in the sort of, I think it was like a 12-hour period where TikTok was banned, all the young people, all the young Americans, and I'm a TikTok user and content creator, I was like, I miss all the Americans. They're really funny. They were like, guys, we've all moved to this other app called Red Note. It's great. I signed the terms and conditions. They're in Chinese. Come across. And so all these young people moved up to Red Note. And so I went onto Red Note and I made an account and I was like, what's going on? And everyone was like, guys, it's just peace, love, and harmony. Like, us Americans, we're learning about Chinese people and we realize that everything we've been told is wrong. And that is just what the American government were trying to do, could not have backfired more spectacularly, of getting all their young people having loads of communication with youth in China and just realizing, whoa, actually, there's a lot of stuff that we're told that maybe is not true. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like we're seeing governments taking massive kind of blunt force approaches to try and not even reduce fragmentation, but just try and almost control young people and just suppress their online presence. And I feel the TikTok ban is such a great example of how badly that can have completely the opposite effect of what is intended.
Thank you. Really interesting story on the unintended consequences of trying to regulate, especially young people who are always trying to find a way to circumvent. Rachel.
Over the years, I've done quite a lot of work thinking about almost safety, and I used to be exec at Ofcom. And I think there's a real missed opportunity that we've not gone down the path of regulating algorithmic recommendation, that there was a possibility there of keeping people maybe a little bit more in the fire hose of content. And I think if you look at, it's amazing how much young people are very often the target of everyone's worry. Whereas actually, and I feel like I'm allowed to say this as much the oldest person on the panel, it's the old people who are the problem. It's people on Facebook who think that a comment in a group that they're in is representative of the world as a whole, and that we have a lot of political intensification and radicalization that happens because opinion has become news. And if you look in the US, I think Pew have done some research into where different people get their news from. And you see that particularly older demographics are very reliant on either local news or Facebook. And that actually there are not many people who are getting real information about the whole of the world, right? And so there's something about what happens to us. We used to call it a filter bubble, when everything we think is reinforced. So I think that's one part of it, and one thing to be continually looking at. And just as like a thought experiment, like something I'm always really interested in is what would it look like if the internet thought I was a man? And there used to be a thing you could do back when Twitter was like normal, where you could change your references. And I can say that being a 52-year-old woman on the internet, I get advertised a lot of slippers, supplements, that kind of thing. It's not very glamorous. And I was asking around, and a friend of mine was saying, like, as a man my age, it's all about making money, having muscles, being more effective. Like, you're like in this world in which you're being targeted as a direct rather than as an individual. And I suppose I have really mixed feelings about this, because one of the reasons that got me online years ago was the ability to find the one or two other people who really like the thing that I liked, right? And to be in community with them. And that I think something just really important to be thinking about is, how do we balance and hold the incredible opportunity to be globally in community and to find the only other person in the world who really cares about the thing that's on your mind, without radicalizing everyone into like an Instagram hellhole. And there's a lot to be held there, but I would really say, as Alice was talking about, it's really easy for old people to put all the anxiety onto the youth. I have a lot more confidence, I would say, in people under 30 than I do in those of us who are advancing in years to get this right.
Thank you, Rachel. Finally, Sheetal.
Great. Yes, I wanted to pick up on some of those points, and I thought we would be talking about the social media ban in Australia, because I think it is such an important example of this point that you were making, Alice, about blunt forces and the causes of internet fragmentation. As we were discussing in the policy network, for example, building out the framework to try and understand what it is and how to address it within the multi-stakeholder community, we kept coming up against this point that it's both intended and unintended. So in trying to address issues, often societal issues, like you say, broader ones, narrow, technical, blunt instruments or policy instruments are used without consideration for the broader impact or the impact on vulnerable or marginalized people. And that, I think, is, to put it in another way, you could say the way to hell is paved with good intentions. We all know that. We're thinking about how we could rephrase that. I think now, as you say, we're 20 years on from the World Summit on the Information Society. A lot has changed. We also have a lot more tools and understandings and ways that the International Human Rights Framework, for example, has been adapted to try and address these issues. We've had many discussions, and I think that we should pave it with, not to hell, to maybe the other way, with impact assessments, of which we have many, because we know, I think, what we need to do. I could have sat here 5 years ago, and what I'm going to say, people would have been, I think, nodding away. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Because when I said before about misogyny being, and as you were saying, Alice, there's the manosphere and that's a social issue. It's also, I think, there is a technical element insofar as it's profit making, misogynistic content. There are algorithms that drive this type of content, and there is therefore an incentive to not address it. So there is that aspect. And everybody knows that now, though, don't they? That's not news for any of us. We've heard that so many times before. So why is it still happening? We know the impact. We know how to measure the impact of policies and regulation. I'm sure many of there's the Internet Society, a framework for addressing the policy impacts, potential policy impacts on the internet and its key characteristics. Yesterday, the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, in fact, it's actually happening now, they're holding a summit called RightsX, which is dedicated to this intersection of human rights and digital tech and AI. And their Wikipedia, the Wikimedia Foundation, mentioned and presented what they're calling Wikipedia tests, which is for policy and regulators to be able to look at a policy and understand whether or not it could have an impact, a negative impact on a platform or a community like Wikipedia. So there's so many tools out there. I'm not saying there's too many. I don't think that they're being used enough. And I think that's the issue. We're still continuing to see blunt force reactions to complex societal and technical issues. We're not seeing enough of these kind of spaces, to be honest, where everyone gets together to discuss the complexity of the issue. We're not thinking through the impact more broadly of a policy or regulation, which goes back to my earlier point about the need to center values, user agency, control, and rights to address the issues that we're talking about.
Thanks, Sheetal. I think at this point, we should probably have a look at the results. Do you think your online experience resembles most other people's? 23% of you have said yes, and I guess the majority of you, 51%, have said no, with 26% being maybe. I think that sort of is consistent with my own and hopefully everyone else's impression of the discussion, given that a lot of different individuals would have different experiences based on these intersectional factors. But in looking at, I think, the explanations of them, there's quite a lot. So I would like to pick out a couple from the audience that I thought were very interesting. One of them resonates a lot with what Alice was talking about, resonate with the gaming platforms comment. It's gotten to a point that my friend uses a fake accent while I try not to speak. So when playing in the UK, other than that, I feel like my social media is similar to my friends. I think that is a very interesting comment. Thank you to everyone who's been providing comments. There's another one as well. I suspect to have more ubiquitous access than many folks, and that's true. Digital inclusion is a very big part of the conversation on fragmentation. And I'm naturally fairly careful about the services I use, but I generally have the privilege to make those sorts of choices. And again, we're touching upon the conversation of choice and agency. And there is another comment as well that I think segues quite well into another part of the conversation that I'd like to get to, which is on age verification. And I guess a comment now, or moving the discussion towards the UK perspective of digital and internet fragmentation, and compare and contrast that to what we've seen in other parts of the world, or at least global experience. What are some things about the United Kingdom that are quite unique in terms of this issue of digital fragmentation? And in what ways is the UK similar? Is there a point where we can learn from the experiences of other countries, or is there something that we believe we've done quite well that we could hopefully try to promulgate and expand upon with the rest of the internet community? I guess I'll start with you, Rachel, if you have some thoughts on this. And then I'm just making it up, sorry.
Yeah. So I'll take the opportunity now the minister has left to mention, so those of us who've been knocking around in digital policy in the UK for a while be familiar with a phrase that seems to come up again and again, which is the best place in the world to start a digital business and the safest place in the world to be online, which I think Matt Hancock was responsible for that about 7 or 8 years ago, and which came back as government policy last year, I think fleetingly. And it's a really interesting proposition. Yeah, because what it presents is a paradox. On one hand, we're saying from a policy perspective that we're open to the more disruptive business-oriented forces while building a very robust garden. And the thing is, I think there is no evidence that is possible. And I think there's this idea that we're very special and that we can somehow have a slightly different internet to everybody else, even though we are fundamentally a vassal of the US in this respect. And so I think particularly looking at age verification, to me, it is a good example of a theatre in which we don't have to think about how things really work if we've created a barrier for people to jump over. And I think one of the reasons I think there are two particular reasons age verification is a problem. One of them is, of course, related to privacy and security. But the other is the idea that we're not really allowing people to grow up. I'm really interested in the idea that everyone is meant to wake up one day aged either 13, 16 or 18, depending on who you're talking to, having had no experience of most things on the internet and then be totally capable. If what we want to do is to create a kind of rounded, confident, capable people who can shape what happens next, then we need to put their rights first. And I think age verification is like a very useful thing to be able to announce to a politician. In real life, it's a lot less.
Thank you, Rachel. Should we go to you, Sheetal?
Sure. I can also comment a bit on global frameworks, but just in terms of your question about what I had time was you were speaking, Rachel. I was listening to what you were saying, but I was also thinking about the experiences I've had elsewhere of the internet as a user and options and choices, like I mentioned. I think the situation has changed in the UK and has become more monopolistic. But I think there are other countries where the options are even less. So you can travel to countries where really you only have one option to be connected to the internet. If you move there, there's this one provider, you need to go with them, and that's that. I think in the UK, at least, there has been a more diversified market. In certain parts of the country, of course, you might not have as much of a choice. But I think that's important. And that goes back to the point about how important it is to have agency and control, to be able to make choices and to not have a monopolistic market, which then entrenches essentially not very good practice because people don't have a choice. So they just have to stick with bad customer experience. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that we do actually value that here, and that in other places people don't have that. And it does require policy and regulation to ensure the market is open and that people have options and choices. So that's one example. And then I was just going to say that at the global level, we have the UN Global Digital Compact, and we'll be looking at in 2027 at the summit how the UN has been doing on that. And I think that we need to start thinking through exactly the commitment on internet fragmentation, which is in there, and figuring out how we measure it, how we understand it. And in the policy network, we've been trying to do that. I think these spaces are really important for that. And these questions are really important. And we need to really bring real life experience to that discussion, because it is so important and it can't remain abstract. It is really about what the conversation we're having here, which is everyday experience and the impacts that policy and regulation have, and the importance of maintaining and strengthening norms that protect an open and inclusive internet.
Thanks, Sheetal. Alice?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to surprise anyone by saying I don't think that age verification is necessarily the fantastic solution that we might hope it could be. I think it's really interesting, like with Australia, with America, and also thinking about my experience growing up as this more kind of digital native, feeling always like my parents' generation are so far behind where the young people's minds are, and that it's like they're trying to control such a small part of what is such a huge problem. And I feel like I was really struck by this person who said like their friend uses fake accent while they're gaming. And that I feel like with a lot, like gaming is such a huge thing that I think is often just brushed aside as that's just silly. That's just something that young people do. And it's almost like the people that make a game make it in their own image. They make it with their worldview and they instill their values into it. I think Call of Duty is such a great example of this, of the company that make Call of Duty had a lot of controversy around their attitudes towards women, and you see their sort of that behavior, the misogyny, trickles through all the users of the game. And I'm a big gamer. I watch lots of like live streams, and I was watching this sort of like back and forth between a female game reviewer and a male game reviewer. And the male game reviewer gets a word slightly wrong from some detail of this franchise. And the woman's, if I made that mistake, if I got that tiny word wrong, I would have all these messages from all these nerdy people who they'd be saying things to me like, oh, we should have gate-kept games harder. This is why it's really bad when women game. And I think also there's this some of the most powerful stuff I've seen about division online and division in sort of gaming and social media spaces is where technology is used as an instrumental tool to try and show people that it's like you don't know what you don't know and you don't have insights into other people's experiences. And like gaming can be a wonderful way of like immersing yourself in the experience of another person. So like with Call of Duty, I've seen this it was like a social experiment where they got men to put on a voice modulator and do a COD live stream sounding like women. And they'd do all the things they'd normally do. And they'd be like, hey guys, who's online? And they would just immediately be met with misogynistic abuse, just straight away, horrible things being said to them. And they were really shocked. And I've seen other things like that of a horror game where you're playing as a woman walking home at night. And the men playing it would be like, wow, this is what you live with like every day. And I feel like those kind of pieces of work are so much more powerful and unifying than just being like, oh, let's just do age verification. Let's just make everyone just abstinence approaches that are just about, if we just push everything down and pretend nothing exists, it'll all be fine. Whereas I feel like, let's do a more education-based approach. And there are actually loads of ways that you can think about addressing this division and getting people to see things from a different perspective.
All right. Given that we are running slightly low on time, there was a Slido question after this, which we are going to skip to the other Slido question after that. So the question was, do you think internet fragmentation is inevitable? Yes, no, why not? We are not going to do that, unfortunately, because we will move to, I think, the real heart and core of the matter, which is, if you could change anything about your internet experience right now, what would it be? And there's a secondary question after that, which is, who would be responsible for that change? And I think for us as panelists over here, I'd like to encourage you to think about and probably comment on the policies that need to be implemented to tackle internet fragmentation, as well as what we as users can do to recognize fragmentation and avoid it. If there is any other stakeholder group you would like to bring into this as well, for example, it could be academia, it could be the private sector. We've talked about the role of these monopolistic infrastructure providers. What would each of these key stakeholder groups, what can they do? What should they do? What should they be responsible for when it comes to avoiding the negative side of internet fragmentation? And I guess I'll encourage I forgot the order. Sheetal, we'll go with you first, and then we'll carry along this.
But again, it's great to be having this conversation with the wisdom that we have of 20 years since the first World Summit on the Information Society tried to grapple with what ICTs, as we call them then, were going to mean, and actually ask this very question: what is everyone's roles and responsibilities? And put it in the Tunis agenda. Everyone has their respective roles and responsibilities. And I think now that we know the power and the responsibility of the private sector, for example, we need to ensure that they are held to account, and there's a plurality of providers and platforms for when they don't respect user rights. And that is not happening enough. There is a role of course, governments in ensuring that is also not happening enough. As I said, there are many tools, many impact assessments, gender impact assessments, human rights impact assessments that people have worked tirelessly in order to produce those to map the human rights framework alongside what the full supply chain and the staff. That those tools are out there. We need to use them. Again, I think civil society is already doing a good job of engaging, as you said, Alice, in sort of media literacy. There's so many great examples. It's almost a question of will, I think, more than anything else. You can find them all over the world. I've had the pleasure of working with civil society groups all over the world that do amazing work with hard to reach communities or communities that are otherwise, for example, women who have faced abuse online, finding it difficult to go back online. There's so much that can be done, which doesn't require the blunt force approaches that we've discussed by working in collaboration with stakeholders, people impacted by a negative use of the internet or challenged by it. Digital literacy and digital inclusion, like you mentioned, Rachel, there's a lot there. And then I think academia, I'm just using these stakeholder groups loosely, but it is the UN parlance, isn't it? There's a lot of research as well that is being done. I think we need to take that and use that. Again, we have these spaces where we come together. I think it's really incumbent as well on policymakers to be able to create those and ensure that policymaking is inclusive when they are having these discussions, because the work is out there. It is being done and it needs to reach the right places and people in order to have an impact.
Thanks, Sheetal. And if I could encourage Rachel and Alice to be brief in the responses so that we can leave some time for audience comments as well. Rachel, yes.
I've got, I suppose, two things. One is, I think we have an opportunity to really be supporting independent, community-led infrastructure. I ran a workshop earlier in the year where we had people who are making like community-owned, managed AI, who were talking about the difficulty of market entry now, that actually everything is so big, monopolistic. And we need to be thinking about not just what the investment needs are, but the regulatory needs to sort of lift up that pluralism. And I think in terms of the other thing that I would really want to change, and I don't necessarily have a great answer for this, but it's like the normalization of like low quality LLM generated content. That the fact that whether online or just digitally generally, the fact that it is easier to generate a longer, less interesting, worse thing than it is to write a shorter, more interesting one, means that we are going to be drowning in information that no one needs. It's not even really information. But I think if that was an urgent thing to address, that's what I would prioritize.
Thank you. Alice?
I would change three things. Education, not an abstinence approach, because I think of those children in Australia, they get to 16 and then they're just released on social media with no preparation for the horror show that awaits them. I think you think about the NSPCC is doing really amazing work in education, and especially education for parents, about a child who's 4 needs a really different sort of education about the internet than a child who is 12, because they're encountering different things and they are at a different developmental stage. And I think if I was to get any other sort of stakeholder, it would be all about education, all about in schools, teaching young people, like the stuff I was talking about before of simulations of other people's world experiences. They're so readily available. Like you could just go on your laptop right now and find a game that shows you what it's like to be a person who's completely different to you. And I feel like we're not using this enough. We're not curious about it. And I think education, that would be the thing I want to change.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I think we'll look at the answers that you've provided. The interesting thing about it is that the answers that you provide would have formed a word cloud. And there was a brief moment where it said the social media content in order. which I thought was absolutely fantastic. But there are a number of different comments I'm seeing over here, some harking back to the conversations we had on competition-related issues and monopolies, breaking Google up. We're seeing more control that users want, the control that they should have as opposed to governments. It was made very clear in one comment that we said more control by me in brackets. A lot of regulating algorithms, making it less addictive, ensuring that there's a difference between human-related content and content that's generated by AI. A lot of them also on privacy being very important for a large number of our respondents. But I think based on the percentages, and we'll be able to move to the next slide and see this, the responsibility predominantly, we feel, rests with government. There is some that say that users are responsible as well, as second most popular answer. And again, ultimately, given that this is a subject about user experience, we feel that is concomitant with the expectations that we've had for this. So I'd like to open it up very briefly to anyone who would like to continue this discussion about what you would change or who should be responsible for those changes, or even give us an interesting sort of anecdote if you would like. I see we have an online question. Unless there's anyone else who would like to go first and give us some very brief comments, we can move online. Oh, we have one over there? Okay, I guess we'll start with yourself, sir. I think there should be a mic coming. Not entirely sure. Yes, the gentleman at the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was really interesting discussion. My name is Adam Smith. I represent Advocacy International. And just based on the government being the biggest word there and a lot of people talking about algorithmic control, I would just like to push back on that a little bit, because I think while it seems very attractive, it is also, I think, illiberal to some extent. We've seen what happens in the United States when tech has been aligned with the Democrats to get moved over to the Republicans, and that has changed. We have right now a government that has a huge mandate in one direction. In 2 years, the polls say we are very close to a government that is mandated in a very different, depending on your view, a very different direction. And do we really want to be handing over the controls of what people can or can't see to essentially the ideology of the day? I think what is potentially more valuable, and something that was mentioned by you very excellently, is that this kind of extremist content comes, I think, from the economic push. The economic push. If you harvest more data, you can push people to more extreme content. You can make it more individual. And if we don't tackle that at the root, at that kind of level, then I worry we're just going to be handing things back and forth between the people that could be necessarily the most censorious. Mitt Romney, if you remember, before the TikTok ban, said that one of the reasons for doing it was because of the presence of Palestinians on the website. The online safety bill has blocked the subreddit of cider makers and also a lot of content from Palestine. I think it might seem like a simple solution. It's only a simple solution if the people you want to do it continue to win, and nobody wins for long.
Thank you so much for the comment. We have another interesting conversation later on today about digital ID, which will touch upon those topics about how can we trust the government to do what we ask them to do. One online question over there to Alicia, yes. To Alicia in the front, yes.
So a question from Olivier online, which is, could the algorithms that determine what is shown and promoted to each one of us ever become both transparent and ethical?
This question to the panel, we'll ask for a very quick word on that. Could algorithms ever be?
Yes, they have to be, I think. And again, there's a lot of work happening on this. There are indices, there are frameworks, there are audits. There is, of course, I can't exactly remember the name, but there is a whole AI auditing profession with like union or group of people working together to develop standards around which they will hold themselves accountable. So I think it's happening, and it's very important that we integrate all of that into the beginning and the full supply chain of AI, because at the moment we lose hope of having transparency and a rights-based or ethical-based approach to algorithms, well, what's the point? Again, we have to ask ourselves, what's the point of the technology? What's it for? Who is it for? Who does it serve? And so we really need to keep that in mind, I think. So the answer is yes.
I would say no, not at all. That actually the problem is what an algorithm represents is the perspective or just decision of one person or a group of people that is then imposed on others. And the possibility and likelihood that everybody will be tweaking their algorithms is like close to zero. So I think he possibly misunderstood what I was advocating for, not a tightening of the algorithmic recommendation, but a legislation to remove algorithmic recommendations or to make them much, much harder. I think that the possibility of meaningfully improving that now, maybe that could have happened 15, 20 years ago, but I think that's past it.
Cool. Alice, would you like to tackle that as well or not?
I mean, it's very tricky. I guess the trouble is that all the algorithms are based on the worldview that is baked into the whole internet and has been for decades. So it's not something that could be a quick fix or that are sort of coming at it from the point of view of, oh, if we just tweak the algorithm, it will be better. It's more like if all your training data has a particular worldview, there's only so far your algorithm is going to get.
Can I just say quickly on that I think it's very important to have a more nuanced discussion around this. There's public sector deployments of AI, for example, that are having impacts on people, and they might not know that is the case. So I think there is an emerging consensus that needs to not be the case, and there are ways to address that. There is the use of algorithms, of course, for content moderation that can be helpful under certain conditions. And so I think it's very important to, again, we're talking about blunt approaches, to have discussions that are focused on specific areas and deployments, but of course, always ensure that we have these principles of accountability and transparency at heart.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We would love to continue this conversation with all of you. This is, I believe, the most foundational internet policy issue because it largely encompasses every single part of what we do. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for your engagement throughout and providing us with very interesting comments and feedback. And we're more than happy to engage with you on the subject matter afterwards as well. Please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. A reminder that balancing, maximizing choice, minimizing fragmentation is always a challenge. And looking at the word cloud, how we have that tension between user choice and government regulation continues on the internet, on the online world.